They're the first serious clashes, rather, in the region since the Day of Rage rallies, and that was on the 28th of January. Well, the role of the country's armed forces has been in the spotlight ever since protests in Egypt began late last month. The military has, by and large, stood on the sidelines as protests spread across the country, but will it continue to do so in the future? Well, the Vice President, Omar Suleiman, has warned of a possible coup by the army if protests continue indefinitely. Soldiers out on the streets of Egypt were welcomed by protesters early on, and some suggested it could convince some of them to go home. Generals did call on the demonstrators to end their agitation, but that didn't happen. Others say the army won't go against one of its own. The president, Hosni Mubarak, is of course a decorated military man, and troops stood by while pro and anti-Mubarak protesters clashed in central Cairo last week. Let's get some perspective on the military and more, and speak to Tariq Masoud. He's an assistant professor of public policy at Harvard University and joins us live from Boston. Thank you for your time on Al Jazeera. Do you think that the army would step in as the foreign minister in Egypt is warning?
It's a very surprising warning by the foreign minister, and of course it's very difficult to predict precisely what the army will do. I think what we have seen so far is that the army hasn't been standing by, but rather has been standing by Mubarak. The neutrality shown by the military towards the protesters as they were being attacked by the quote-unquote pro-Mubarak protesters, I think, reveals very clearly that this military has a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, and that for the time being they've calculated is a Hosni Mubarak presidency.
So what you're saying is that the military at this point is listening and will continue to listen to the regime, the Mubarak regime?
Absolutely. And I would also say that those who threaten a military coup have to understand that, the people aren't going to buy that as a change. In other words, the military currently runs Egypt. I mean, Mubarak obviously is the face of that and had managed to aggrandize and enrich himself. But fundamentally, the nature of this regime wouldn't change if there were a military coup. And so the question is, how does this cause the protesters to think that there's anything different at all? I don't understand. Well,
today, Mr. Masoud, we saw thousands of workers go on strike right across Egypt, and there are reports that there's more to come tomorrow and the rest of the week. But it just seems like the government is digging its heels in at this point, and so are the protesters.
Well, I think what's really remarkable about this is that the protesters do not seem to be losing steam. They seem to be gaining steam. And everybody's prediction, including mine, was that eventually there would be a kind of fatigue setting in, and that the protesters and Egyptians in general would want to go back to a regular life, especially since Mubarak had made some significant concessions in terms of agreeing not to stand again and agreeing to a process of a constitutional reform. But I think what we're seeing now is that Egyptian people are not buying it, and that the protests are not losing their force. And so I think it's going to be very hard for the Mubarak regime to continue to ignore them.
Okay, so what are the options right now as we stand? What are the options for real political change in the country? Essentially, we're at a standstill. Mubarak's not going anywhere. The protesters not going anywhere. And no one has the power to change the constitution unless given the go-ahead by Mubarak. So what are the options now?
So that's a great question. So first of all, if the protesters continue protesting and the size of the protests increases, I don't think that we could say that Mubarak isn't leaving. It may very well be that the military could calculate that we need to get Mubarak out, and then the question is, would the protests stop or would they continue? But that's one path that we could observe. You're right that there's another path, and your reporter mentioned the Committee of the Wise Men, or just the Wise. And these people are basically trying to advocate for a path of reform that uses the existing constitution. And as you correctly noted, that President Mubarak would have to remain in place to initiate some of those reforms, because only an elected president can do that. And so that's one other path. The question is, you have to believe that Mubarak would do that, and he would negotiate in good faith, and that he wouldn't just use this, and the military wouldn't just use this as an opportunity to consolidate its hold and drag things out. One argument that I've heard made, and that I believe is actually quite persuasive, is that what the opposition should be calling for right now are parliamentary elections to be conducted under international auspices and with significant oversight by domestic judges, and with some changes to the rules governing how you validate people's votes. So instead of using the corrupt voter rolls, you would use maybe their ID cards. But
okay.
I think that might offer a way to move the protests, to institutionalize the protests, and give the protesters some power in Parliament from which they could dictate the pace of reform.
All right. Tarek Masoud, thank you very much for joining us there live from Boston.
Thanks.
Well,